Thank you very much. I have never given a lecture at this time of day because I'm a very traditional man. I was raised in a family where we always had dinner between 12 and 13, so this is something new for me. I hope I can go through it without problems. I shall concentrate my lecture today on the theme the Cold War and historical research. I know it's not what is written in the historical significance of Nordic communism, but I will also come into this. I've decided also to integrate my personal experience as a Danish scholar in this field for many years. Communism and later in the period of the Cold War, the so-called New Left, are crucial for an understanding of the period we call the Cold War in all the Nordic countries. These ideological and political movements are also essential for an analysis of the historiography of the Cold War and by implication the public's understanding of this period in the history of the Nordic countries. So I will first briefly introduce myself as a scholar and hope you will not find my behavior too immodest. Then I shall give a brief analysis of what the Cold War, in my opinion, was all about. Then I shall briefly touch on the nature of Bolshevism and the Soviet experience. I am deeply convinced that you cannot really grasp the nature of the Cold War without such an understanding. I am also convinced that many disagreements among professional historians who write about the Cold War is rooted in different understandings of Bolshevism and the whole Soviet experience. Then I will say a few words about the extremely abnormal conditions for the study of the Cold War while the Cold War was going on, and also to some degree today. It has not been normalized even today. Then I shall give some example of the works of leading Western scholars and a few Danish textbooks, plus a contemporary British scholar's new work about the Cold War. And finally, I shall present some of the findings on the role of communism, the New Left, and what I call the Cultural Revolution in Denmark during the Cold War. A few words about myself. I was educated at the University of Aarhus in Copenhagen in the 60s, after I have been working as an electrician for some years. I defended my doctoral thesis in 1979 at the University of Copenhagen, and my main research fields have since then been Russian Soviet history, the Soviet system, Marxism, Leninism, Soviet historiography, left-wing and communist intellectuals, the Danish Communist Party, and the Cold War. What was the Cold War about and what caused this conflict? The term Cold War was coined by George Orwell in October 1945 when he wrote, just after the Second World War, "We may be heading not for general breakdown, but for an epoch as horribly stable as the slave empires of antiquity." The Soviet Union was, according to Orwell, a state at once unconquerable and in a permanent state of Cold War with its neighbors. I think this is a rather precise definition, but he was a clever man, in my opinion, George Orwell. The Cold War was, according to my view, caused by what you can call the revolt against Western values, which Lenin and his comrades started in 1917. As a matter of fact, I think the Cold War, which we normally think it was a phenomenon after 45, it covers the whole period. And this extended Cold War was a global conflict which lasted for most of the 20th century. It ended as it did, if you will put it in Soviet and Marxist terms, with the victory of capitalism over socialism, but this was not a foregone conclusion at the time when the conflict was still going on. The Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 and the years after was a challenge to Western democratic capitalism, but also, and this is an important point, it was also a challenge to Western democratic socialism. And they understood it, both parties at the time. What was fundamentally at stake was the destiny of Western pluralistic democracies. It was not so much a classic conflict between conventional states about territories, but a total war, short of shooting, of course. And it was a war with two fronts, an exterior and an interior, because the threat was perceived as twofold in the West. One threat emanated from the Soviet Union and its allies after 1945 in the socialist world. The other threat came from within the democratic societies, from the parties and organizations which were loyal not to their own countries or societies, but to the Soviet Union. Today, it must be very difficult for people who has not lived through this period, I should think, to comprehend that such a destructive ideology was governing a series of states in Europe, and that a demonic person like Stalin was admired by millions of people, not so much in his own country, but also in democratic countries. But it was so at the time. I think Bolshevism was, and is, a simple and brutal ideology. It's Darwinism put into social and political affairs. Its main principle was, as Lenin himself said, Kto war, who will conquer who, the right of the strongest and the submission of the weakest. I'll just give one example. Molotov, who was Stalin's foreign commissar for a long period, told when he was an old man, he looked back on his career, he said, "My task as a Minister of Foreign Affairs was to extend the frontiers of the Soviet Union as much as possible." And he added somewhat later, we, as the Soviet Union, needed the Baltic states, so we took them. After the war, we needed Libya because we wanted to establish a naval base there. Then they didn't take Libya because there was British and American resistance to it. There was also in the 20th century another, but a much shorter conflict between Western democracies and totalitarian forces of another kind. The Nazi regime in Germany from 1933 to 1945. In this conflict, the Soviet Union was also involved, but in a rather strange way. At a critical time, from 1939 to 1941, the Soviet Union was a de facto ally of Nazi Germany. Later on, from 1941 to 1945, it was a de facto ally of the Western democracies. This last conflict, the conflict between the Nazi regime and the rest of the world, has cast its long and heavy shadow over the Cold War and, in my opinion, blurred our understanding of it to this day. For various reasons, Nazism has occupied the interest of, and it has fascinated historians to the neglect of the study of Bolshevism and the Soviet experience. The condemnation of, or the critical approach to Nazism among scholars in Western countries is almost total, but it's quite a different thing as regards Bolshevism or communism. Now a few words about what I call the Soviet experience. What happened in Russia in October 1917 and in the years after the Bolshevik seizure of power was so radically different from the European experience up to then that it cannot be comprehended by familiar concepts. It was in fact the conscious extinction of a European civilization with the purpose to establish a new and not hitherto seen utopian society which presupposed what they called the creation of a new man. That means it was not a society for ordinary human beings. It was, as has been said, a thoroughgoing revolt against the West established since the Enlightenment a wholesale rejection of an entire way of life and its economic underpinnings, and the substitution of something new and entirely alien in terms of culture and experience. This brutal and bloody experiment demanded the sacrifice of human levels on a scale which is beyond comprehension. Lenin and his comrades literally conquered and occupied Russia, military and by limitless terror. Their main idea was to clean, or as they said, to cleanse Russia and later the rest of the world, to wipe away what they called all the filth and impurity in order to build a new, clean and perfect society. In this respect, they remind me very much of the Nazis, which also were obsessed by this, the cleanliness and dirt, to be dirty and people and so on to be liquidated, and also creating of a new German man. Identified capitalists, landowners, noblemen, officers, priests, and other categories as filthy, and named these people former people. That means people who should not belong to the new society. They were legally placed and later also physically outside the new socialist society. They had no rights, only obligations. They were used as hostages in the class war, and they were liquidated collectively without any trial. Soon also, workers would be executed as counter-revolutionaries if they went on strike, for instance. And later so-called kulaks, that is small peasants, small farmers, were murdered by the millions, including women and children, in order to uproot the small Russian freeholders, which constituted 80, not 18, but 80% of the Russian population. About 8 million human lives were taken to make Soviet agriculture what they called socialist. I have always found it, not always, nearly always, a deeply disturbing fact that all these atrocities were greeted as progressive by Nordic communist parties and many intellectuals. And it's still more disturbing that as the regime's brutality grew by the years, more and more intellectuals became fascinated by this regime and its number one. The result of the Soviet Communist parties, what they called the building of socialism, was a militarized society under a totalitarian regime in conflict with the rest of the world. When this regime ceased to exist, the Cold War also came to an end. I think this is a simple and true explanation of why the Cold War came to an end in 1991, the same year as the Soviet Union collapsed. I think the Soviet Union and this system was the whole engine in the Cold War. Now a few words about what I call the abnormal conditions for the study of the Soviet Union and other socialist states during the Cold War. I have often asked myself, but now it's too late, why I didn't choose another subject, for instance Italian history or history of Greece, something like that. There were no problems with traveling there, with contact with colleagues, have a good climate, good food. The Soviet Union was the absolute opposition in a number of ways, also as regards climate. But I don't think that many historians realize how abnormal conditions were if you, as I did, chose to study this country or this system or other socialist states during the Cold War. There have been, of course, to a great extent, a hindrance for the understanding of what these regimes really were. First of all, there was the extensive falsification of history in the Soviet Union and in the other countries. A conscious falsification of history, especially of history of the Soviet period, but in principle of all history. The archives were closed. I tried in vain in the 70s to go to the Soviet Union, but what they gave me was absolutely useless. There were either non-existent or very abnormal contacts with Soviet colleagues. You could not have a free discussion, you could not exchange views, you could not visit each other. It was always a Soviet delegation who came to your country, or a Danish delegation to their country, and then you had spokesmen, and it was all very artificial. It was impossible to publish what I would call normal historical works in the Soviet Union. Also, if you were not a Soviet scholar. The people who professionally studied these countries were small and partly isolated groups in the Western countries. And you were under constant attack from Soviet loyalists and many leftists outside the Soviet Union if you wrote critically about the Soviet Union and its regime. I think I have to leave it there, but I could of course go more into it if there is a wish for it afterwards. Now a few words about Western and also to some degree Danish historiography on the Cold War. When I as a young student started to study the history of the Bolshevik Revolution in the 60s, one of the great stars was a British historian called Edward Hallett Carr. One of the leading Western experts on Soviet economic development was also an English historian, Maurice Dobb. And a third star was the former Trotskyist Isaac Deutscher, whose book on Stalin was widely read also outside the academic republic. The works of these three British historians were all on the curriculum of my university in Denmark in the 60s. They made a great impression on me and my view on the Soviet Union. Later, many years later, I completely changed my positive evaluation of these works. And I'll just give you a few hints about those historians. Carr's history of the Bolshevik Revolution from the 50s and 60s is permeated by admiration of Lenin, the great theorist, the great administrator, and the great statesman. What is extraordinary is that Carr hardly mentions the monstrous costs in human lives caused by the great Lenin's policies. What happened to ordinary human beings was completely outside his focus. I would say he was an apologist of the victors in the Russian tragedy in the 20th century. Maurice Dobb, the economic historian, was an admirer of Stalin and the Stalinist system. He published his works in the 30s and the 40s. He wrote a very widely known textbook called Soviet Economic Development, which was first published in 1948 and has countless reprints. He also totally ignored the human costs of the enforced collectivization, which, as I have already said, cost about 8 million lives, and also the cost of the huge concentration camp system, which was an integrated part of the Soviet economy, the Gulag. Strangely enough, he counts the loss of animals during the enforced collectivization, but not people. Deutscher, I will go without him because time is short. But these books were all published by the most prestigious publishing houses in England, America, all over the world, sold in paperback editions, and received admiring reviews in historical journals and leading newspapers. It was during the Cold War, not in Soviet Russia, but in the so-called free world. In my own country, Denmark, a whole school of Soviet experts were writing, teaching, and lecturing in the universities, in the high schools, in the 70s and 80s. Their approach to the study of the Soviet Union was apologetic. They called it in Danish selvforståelse. You should always take as your point of departure the Soviet understanding of itself. In a textbook widely used in Danish high schools, which was first published in 1980 and later on many times in reprints, the historian expressly declined to discuss the costs of the enforced collectivization. His argument was as follows, I quote, "The collectivization happened the way it happened, and it is useless to discuss the question of costs. It's of course true it happened the way it happened, but why it is useless to discuss the question of costs, I can't understand. It would be impossible to write, for instance, about Nazi concentration camp and conclude like this. I won't discuss the victims of the concentration camp." He was, by the way, also employed by the Danish Ministry of Education as a consultant. A few words about the concept totalitarian and totalitarianism. It was, in my time in the universities, under severe attacks for decades, starting in the 60s and going on far into the 80s. The attackers were mostly from the social sciences, but there were also many historians. Most of the attackers had no scholarly knowledge of the Soviet Union. They were nearly all Marxists. They argued that the concept totalitarian had absolutely no scientific or scholarly value, that it was a purely ideological and political instrument, that it had been invented during the Cold War with the explicit purpose to use it to beat Marxists and the socialist states. In every respect, a Danish historian wrote, it was a harmful concept. I think it was nothing of the sort. The concept was invented in the 1920s by Italian fascists who used it positively about the fascist Italian state. They wanted a totalitarian, they thought it was good. It was then taken up by anti-fascist intellectuals who used it negatively to criticize the fascist regime. The German Nazis, interestingly enough, did not use this concept, but anti-Nazi German scholars used it in the 1930s and afterwards to describe and analyze similarities and difference when comparing Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. And it's an interesting fact that many of those anti-Nazi German scholars who used the term totalitarian were also Marxists. I think totalitarian it was and it still is an apt shorthand name of describing the real existing regimes in socialist countries during the Cold War. It's very interesting, when those systems collapsed, Russians and other Soviet historians at once used this concept about their own country. And even Gorbachev used it in his last year as the General Secretary of the Soviet Communist Party. Now a few examples of historiography on the Cold War, after the Cold War. Some months ago I read a new work by a British historian who's called Jonathan Haslam. Haslam is a pupil of Carr and also his critical biographer. But luckily he is a quite different historian. His book from 2011, which is called Russia's Cold War, is a fantastic book in my opinion. He's a traditional historian in the best meaning of this concept. He does not waste his time on elaborate theories. He goes directly to the heart of the matter. And he is also of the opinion that the Cold War was caused by the Bolshevik regime. On the basis of Soviet sources, which have become available in the last 10, 15 years. He paints a realistic and also a frightful picture of the narrow, claustrophobic clique in the Kremlin, which dominated and directed the Soviet Union almost to the end. He underlines the fateful influence of the military leadership, which was able to almost strangle the Soviet nation and to misuse its resources. One of its many fatal decisions was the massive deployment of the advanced mobile missiles with multiple warheads in 1976 and many years after. Missiles who were all targeted at the big cities in Western Europe. According to a central source which Haslam has found and which comes from the Soviet General Staff of the Soviet Union. He has not been in the archives of the General Staff, it's closed, but it's a former central person who has worked there. The Soviet General Staff and the Soviet military were making plans of nuclear first strikes and limited nuclear wars in Europe in the 80s. The General Staff was of the opinion that thanks to the vast territory of the Soviet Union, it would survive a nuclear war. I will not go further into it. I would now use a few minutes to talk about a work I have been together with three young Danish historians have been working on Denmark's position in the Cold War. It has not been published because we have had many difficulties. We have had access to confidential material and it is now undergoing a process of declassification, and it takes, in my opinion, an incredible lot of time. I hope it will be published before I die. The study is rather big. It consists of 1,000 pages. I have written 2,000 here, but it's only 1,000. It covers the whole period from 45 to 91. It's based on a large and varied source material in many state and private archives, especially Danish, but also Soviet, American, British and German archives. We have had access to the secret archives, or what should we call it, archives which contain secret materials of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, of Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Justice, plus the military intelligence and the political intelligence in Denmark. We have also used a vast amount of published source material in the form of books, articles, newspapers, journals in many different languages. I will just jump to the part of this study which is about the Communist Party of Denmark. The belief that an underdeveloped country, namely Russia, occupied by a Marxist sect, the Bolsheviks, should be an ideal for the working class in developed democratic countries in Europe, North America and elsewhere, was, in my opinion, fundamentally absurd. Nonetheless, there existed in the developed countries for 2 generations political parties, the whole purpose of which was to make propaganda for a totalitarian regime and deny and attack critical information about this regime and its actions. The existence of communist parties in the democratic countries gave a special dimension to the Cold War, also in Denmark and the other Nordic countries. These parties were legal parties, but they were under constant suspicion and observation by the democratic authorities and the secret services. Then the question, of course, is, was this suspicion justified? The short answer is yes, it was, because, as I have already touched upon, these parties' loyalties were not towards their own countries and their own democratic institutions, but towards a foreign power which heavily financed these parties' fight against democratic institutions and the country's security policies. These parties also supplied Moscow and Eastern Berlin and other places with valuable, partly secret information about leading politicians, about political institutions, and also to some degree about military installations. But now the very last part of my lecture. It's very important to also have in focus that when the what you could call the classical communist parties, when they had spent a lot of their force as mass parties in the Nordic countries in the 60s, especially after the Soviet criticism of Stalin and after the suppression of the Hungarian People's Uprising in 1956, these parties, especially in Denmark and Norway and Sweden, I think Iceland is in another category, they were extremely weakened. But then in Denmark, I know most about the Danish experience, the leader of the Communist Party in a generation, Axel Larsen, was a very clever politician and a very loyal man towards Moscow in his time. He realized that his party, his old party, was a party with a very difficult future ahead. So he was, I think he was lucky for that, he was expelled, and he formed a new, not a communist party, but he formed a new party, a new Marxist party called the Socialist People's Party, which, contrary to the old party, became a success, a political success. This new party was especially supported by many young people in the universities and other educational institutions, and from the fast-growing numbers of social workers in the welfare state. The authorities looked at Larsen's new party with deep skepticism and suspicion. When the Internal Intelligence Service in Denmark informed the government about threats to the internal security or to the democratic order in the 60s, it always lumped the new party, the People's Socialist Party, together with the old party. They even used the words about the new party. They were wolves in sheep's clothes. But in 1968, this new party was made clean, so to speak, when it was accepted by the governing Social Democratic Party as a support for its policy. It was called the Red Cabinet. In the 1970s, more and more young Social Democrats of a new generation moved more and more to the left, and in the 1980s, the Social Democratic Party based its opposition to the conservative liberal government security policy on this new party, the Socialist People's Party, and other left-wing parties, including the Communist Party outside Parliament, in street demonstrations and peace rallies and so on. This new party, it is very important to underline, it had no formal connections, no formal ties to the Soviet Union. This is very important. It was not financed by Moscow. It was a national party, a democratic party, a legal party. But this is my assertion, ideologically, the People's Socialists during the Cold War never fully broke with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was to a very big extent still an ideal, and Lenin was quoted many, many times by the new leader of this party, Gerd Petersen, who was the successor of Axel Larsen. As late as 1987, Gerd Petersen thought that Lenin was still a man you should study and to learn from if you were a socialist politician in a democratic country. Fabulous. For him and his comrades, the United States and NATO were still the main enemy, and in foreign policy, in security policy, they had in many ways the same attitude as the old Communist Party. I think I have to finish here in order to give room for some, I hope, critical remarks and questions. Then I should be glad to answer.